Georgia is on everyone's mind. Good evening, everyone. I'm Kimberly Crenshaw, Executive Director of the African American Policy Forum. Together with the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies, we welcome you to part 8 of our Under the Blacklight series. What's the matter with Georgia? Virus, voting, and vigilantism. In the past week, the everyday conditions of Black death have been as pronounced as ever, especially with new revelations in the respective cases of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. And while the hunting and killing of Ahmaud Arbery has become a well-known tragedy, there are still many who've yet to hear the story of Breonna Taylor, a Black woman who was shot when plainclothes policemen raided her home by mistake and shot her 8 times. Taylor was a certified EMT who spent the last week of her life in high-risk service to others. It turned out that the risk that she could not survive was the one for which there is no protection. These 2 deaths, one in broad daylight at the hands of vigilantes, the other in the dead of night at the hyped-up hands of cops on a tragically mistaken errand, together represent what is widely understood within the African American community, that pre-COVID or post-COVID, we have been and remain subject to death by fiat. The specter of our sudden, senseless, and rationalized demise is so routinely associated with the very status of being Black that we've taken to naming innocent activity as apparent offenses. Now, jogging while Black and sleeping in our beds while Black. Now, while we want to put these gut-wrenching tragedies in conversation with COVID, we understand that Arbery and Taylor's death happened before the outbreak had neared its zenith. Nonetheless, these deaths are modern embodiments of racial terror from a time that we like to think is long ago, when there were no rules, laws, or even expectations whatsoever against our lives being taken. They point to an era where the Black franchise was already long suppressed, where the smoldering ruins of Wall Street, Black Wall Street, were reminders that Black economic self-sufficiency was an anathema to white sensibilities, where race riots and lynchings could erupt with devastating suddenness that left an entire group targeted and terrorized, and when the national government utterly relinquished the fate of its erstwhile citizens to the tyranny of white dominion. Some part of the shock of modern day lynching, both state-sponsored and state-enabled, is its forced return to that bygone era. It's the randomness, the exaggerated return to days past that underwrites these killings as exceptionally intolerable. All the while, though, the slow motion death of so many other killers of Black bodies, the many life-compromising conditions of Blackness, moves through Black communities as naturalized pathogens, pathogens that take 15, 20, even 25 years off of Black life as compared to white life. Yet there's no fanfare, marches, media coverage, or political demands to mark these pogroms. It's just the slow, steady removal of Black bodies by way of health and wealth disparities delivered by an invisible hand of fate or choice or natural circumstance. So what do we make now of this devastating intersection between these different modalities marking how Black people die? What exactly does it mean to reopen states when the racially disproportionate death toll is fully known and partly preventable with sheltering in place? And can it be merely incidental that along with the decision to unleash the not so invisible hand are the many systemic comorbidities of Blackness? So the first step to resisting power is to see it squarely and to learn from those who are on the front lines of this battle about how we need to fight back. For this episode, we couldn't think of a better place to shine the Black light than Georgia, the mecca of civil rights struggle, where the eternal flame still burns, and the first Black woman governor came to the brink of success. It's also the state where old school voter suppression still reigns, where its residents are deprived of Medicare, and where its governor competes with our own president in both his ignorance about the disease and his willingness to let people die from it. We focus on Georgia, not to exceptionalize it, but to sit at the knees of those who can teach us COVID's playbook, a playbook that's unfolding in various degrees elsewhere. And we couldn't have assembled a better cross-section of teachers to help us do so. In the first part of today's conversation, I'll be joined by Crystal Femster, professor of African American Studies, History, and American Studies at Yale. She's the acclaimed author of Southern Horrors, Women and the Politics of Rape and Lynching. Anoa Changa, an electoral justice reporter for PRISM and the host of the podcast All the Way with Anoa. And lastly, in the first section, we'll be joined by Emery Wright, a political organizer, movement leader, educator, and the co-director of Project South. After a break to hear from our audience, I'll turn to Talitha LaFloria, an African and African American Studies professor at the University of Virginia and the author of Chained in Silence, Black Women and Convict Labor in the New South. And finally, Latasha Brown, the award-winning organizer, philanthropic consultant, political strategist, and jazz singer who co-founded the Black Voters Matter Fund. As always, throughout this social justice SOS, we want to hear from you. So please comment on our discussion in the Zoom chat below and share the conversation across social media by following me and AAPF on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook using the hashtag Under the Blacklight. We'll be sharing comments and questions with our panelists throughout the event, and we'll be inviting a few guests with questions to our after the show talkback over Zoom. So let's dive in with Crystal Femster. Crystal, one of our abiding themes over the Blacklight series has been the presence of the past unearthed in this moment. Right now, we're seeing guns in state houses across the country. We're hearing the rhetoric of white supremacy everywhere. We're witnessing the acceptance of Black death. So it's certainly unsettling to some, particularly those who have fully embraced the idea that the celebrated breakthrough of the ultimate Black ceiling, the election of Barack Obama in 2008, meant that all these things were behind us. So as a historian of lynching, what is it about the politics, the psychology, the performative dimensions of lynching that those who are shocked by what's happening today may not understand?
First of all, let me just say it's an honor to be in conversation with you, Kimberly, and all of the other guests that you have on tonight. I really have enjoyed our pre-conversations, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have. I want to just start by sort of acknowledging the loss of life, and just want to say I'm sorry for the loss of Arbery, the son. But I also want to say, I think, it was Keisha Lance Bottoms, the mayor of Atlanta, who was among the first to declare the murder of Ahmaud Arbery a lynching. And I think she was right. Oftentimes we think of lynching as something that happened a long time ago. We have those historical markers, from 1890 to 1930 tends to be that nadir that we think about. But I think it was important for Mayor Bottoms to name it as a lynching and not just to reference it as a murder, particularly in a state that has a long history of mob violence, Georgia, right? A state where the first white woman, or the first woman to serve in the U.S. Senate was Rebecca Latimer Felton, who declared in the 1890s, lynch 1,000 Black men a day if necessary to protect the honor of white womanhood. When what she really meant was to protect the economic and political power of the white elite in Georgia. And so anybody who understands the history of lynching in this country knows that it's had a profound impact on race relations, that it's shaped what we might think about as the geographical, political, social, and economic conditions of Black life. And it's still very evident today in our society. Moreover, we know that lynching reinforced a legacy of racial inequality that is just now beginning to be addressed, in part due to the work of Bryan Stevenson with the Equal Justice Initiative. And he is constantly reminding us that lynching isn't just about the past, and it's not just about these individual cases, right? That it's so much a part of the public conversation right now. We've had the passage of the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act in Congress that's before the Senate right now. Just last week, Ida B. Wells was awarded posthumously the Pulitzer Prize citation, and I quote, for her outstanding and courageous reporting on the horrific and vicious violence against African Americans during the era of anti-lynching. Now, Arbery's case reminds us of the ways in which the administration of criminal justice is entangled with the history of lynching in profound and important ways that continue to contaminate the integrity and the fairness of our justice system, right? The ways that Black women and Black men are subjected not only to white supremacist violence, but the failure of the local authorities to act on their behalf, right? Or to actually be implicit and involved in that white supremacist violence. And moreover, it comes as no surprise that we're seeing what I see as the criminalization of Black mobility, whether that's running while Black, or we see the arrest of Black people in Brooklyn for not properly socially distancing, and the rise of white vigilante violence, and the failure of the local, state, and federal governments really to act on behalf of the well-being of Black folks during this pandemic as being linked to this longer history of mob violence. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we're witnessing it in the state of Georgia, a state that has this long history, and a county, right? This Glenn County, there have at least been 4 lynchings that have taken place there alone. And I think it's also a long tradition. More importantly, I think what we have to keep our eye on is that in Georgia, there's a long tradition of Black resistance and organizing around the political, social, and economic empowerment of Black people and their communities. And it's a state in which Black women right now particularly have been out front in demanding racial equality and challenging the disenfranchisement of Black people across the state. So I say that all to say that what happened in Glenn County and what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, it happened before COVID, but it is central to our understanding of what is happening on the ground in Georgia right now in this we can't call it a post-COVID moment, but in this moment where they're wanting to open up the state, right? And I think we can't ignore white fear and white hysteria in a state where Black people are actually out front demanding, action, because these white guys were arrested because Black folks protested, that people did the investigative reporting, the video was linked, but there were people trying to get this story out of Georgia, right? And they got it out. The video, we know that they knew about the video. We just didn't know about the video, right? But that video inspired people to speak out and to call on state and local authorities to act.
Yeah, and thank you so much for mentioning Ida B. Wells and my childhood friend Brian Stevenson. I want to come back to Ida B. in a moment, but I was interested in your thoughts about the distinction that's typically drawn between private vigilante violence, which at least formally is denounced, and public police violence, which is rarely, denounced, at least formally. And I'm wondering whether that divide really makes as much sense as people think it does. I mean, after all, one of the people charged with killing Ahmaud is a former cop. And the DA that effectively sort of authorized it used the language of typical excuses that are given to cops who kill Black people. So is there something that this episode is making more legible about the relationship between private vigilante violence and the official authorization of the state?
I mean, when we look at this is a great question. I don't think there's a simple answer, but I think there is a way that we can see if we look back historically, there's a link between what we might think about as state-sanctioned violence and private vigilante violence, right? That police, when we look at so many cases of mob violence, whether it's women as victims of lynching, Black women as victims or Black men, what you see is a strong link between police brutality and mob violence, right? So that oftentimes in many of the cases that we see, it's particularly the cases that I explored of Black women, or oftentimes Black women and Black families defending themselves against police brutality, right? And then a mob coming back basically to say you can't resist police authority or police brutality. Oftentimes that mob including police officers, right? So as much as we might want to make a clear distinction now between police brutality and mob violence, in the 19th century and early 20th century, those lines weren't clear. And when you look at anti-lynching campaigns and the arguments that they made for anti-lynching laws and bills, oftentimes they linked it to police violence, and they were able to make a case in some states that counties had to be held responsible, particularly if a victim of lynching was taken from police custody, because they understood that that police officers were turning over victims or setting up cases where the mob could come into the jail with keys to take prisoners. So I think there is a connection, and it's not surprising, I think, to any of us that that one of the lynchers of Ahmaud was a former police officer. We also know that historically the police departments across the South and continue to be have white nationalist Klansmen. So to try to disentangle that, I think, is a challenge. And I think we have to think about why we want to disentangle that when we do. What's at stake? What does it allow us not to see? Right? That when we try to disentangle that, we see bad white people, right, in these acting as vigilantes. We don't see a system and a structure that is in place that allows not only vigilantes to act a certain way, but allows police officers to brutalize Black people on an everyday basis, right? So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, it does very much. And it points our energies and our attention to the facilitative dimension of law. The fact that the DA could point to, this citizen's arrest law that basically allowed an ordinary person just to chase down a Black person and shoot them. So it's facilitative that often gets missed when people think about lynching as solely being an act of racially charged, white mobs. Thank you so much for that, Crystal. I want to move to Anoa and ask you to pull this into a wider view of what is happening in Georgia. Sometimes people use the idea of the perfect storm to describe conditions where troubling dynamics that might have been survivable singularly come together, to create a disaster. So right now in Georgia, as elsewhere, there's electoral injustice, there's economic marginality, there's public violence, there's private violence, there's all that, and then there's COVID. So paint a picture for us, if you will, of what it looks like in the eye of the storm.
Really appreciate the question and being here with everyone. Just thinking about all those things coming together, a lot of times we treat politics or electoral issues as if they're separate from all these other factors that are directly impacting our daily lives. And what we're seeing right now with COVID-19, whether it's here in Georgia, whether it's how we saw the elections unfold in Wisconsin and in Ohio, we're seeing the way these things all intersect and exposing these real serious fault lines across the board. And really, it's been a civic engagement lesson for the whole state and the nation as a whole. And a lot of my coverage, when I've been following up with different organizations and leaders, it's been, having to take a step back and ask people how they're even adjusting right now, because you have many organizations, like we have Emery here from Project South, and later we'll talk with Latasha from Black Voters Matter, but like all the civic engagement work, all the organizing, political work people are already doing, on top of that, they often also are responding to community in the midst of social, health, economic crisis, right? And then we also are in the middle of an election season. So we have seen the national conversation, and locally we've had this conversation around vote by mail and expanding use of absentee ballots. Not everyone is favorable, like California already having a vote by mail type system on the books. But with this scaling up of absentee ballot use and trying to explain to people how to use this system, how to access ballots if you live in a state that has no excuse absentee ballot use, we also have Republican leaders, whether they're here in the state, like our state legislative leader Ralston, or nationally, fear-mongering. And there's a long history of fear-mongering around voter fraud, which then leads and supports voter suppression efforts, right? So this also builds onto the voter suppression tactics that we've already seen from Brian Kemp when he was Secretary of State, going back to 2010, with the prosecution of the Quitman 10+2, criminalization of excessive absentee ballot use, ultimately 4 years later was thrown out. And we now, in the middle of COVID-19, in the middle of increasing, absentee ballot use, have his successor, Raffensperger, instituting this absentee ballot fraud task force. So even in the midst of pandemic, in the midst of all these things and systems that need attention, there is this focus on criminalization and actually fear-mongering in a way that undermines ability to access the ballot safely and without harm. So, we have delays with getting ballots. We also have concerns about whether early polling locations are going to be open. Georgia is a place that has had 214 polling locations closed since the gutting of the VRA. We're number 3 after Texas and Arizona. And then 5 of the counties with the most percentage of poll closures are rural counties here in Georgia. So you have this whole synergy in terms of how we exercise electoral power. And then on top of it, you have this other pandemic going on. We are a state that has not had Medicaid expansion, and the list goes on.
You mentioned the gutting of the VRA, and I just want to, take a moment to note how the Supreme Court contributes to the conditions of disenfranchisement's possibility, right? Along with the vote from a son of Georgia, Clarence Thomas. Let's not fail to mention that the gutting of the VRA was made possible by that particular vote, which allowed all of these changes that had the impact of suppressing the Black vote to go forward without any legal intervention. So while we're talking about vote suppression, I still think that many folks throughout the country don't really understand how old school some of this stuff is. So we have Stacey Abrams' campaign, who was on the cusp of being the first Black woman elected governor. Kemp, who was then Secretary of State, purges 500,000 people, holds up registration of 53,000 people, and beats Stacey Abrams by a mere 55,000 votes. And he got away with it. So is there a lesson here for the entire country?
I mean, absolutely. One of the things that we've all learned post-2018, and anecdotally or for individual work, people have known, but I think what we've really seen post-2018 is the need to have a multi-pronged strategy, right? We have the organizing. There are amazing organizations that do voter registration work and actively make sure that people are getting on the rolls. But here in Georgia, even though there's a requirement that you register 30 days before an election, there still is this weird dark period, and maybe Latasha can go on this a little bit more, where the Secretary of State's office or the local county board of elections, they kind of take their time putting people actually on the books. So you may have registered in time to vote for an election, but you may not actually show up, on the books. So there are all these different barriers that are instituted, and folks are thinking about, it's not the old days, right? Where we might actually be back to the old days. Let me correct myself. We just saw the recent, a recent consent decree that prohibited Republicans from doing ballot security measures. So back in the early 80s, there was a case where Republicans actually were recruiting people, former police officers and others, to actually patrol polling locations. And that the consent decree has now expired. So we have, this polarizing election cycle. We have this massive fear mongering around voter fraud. And we do actually have organizations that are actively recruiting former paramilitary, veterans, et cetera, conservative folks, to actually be, monitors in minority and BIPOC communities, specifically saying, you need to go watch these people because this is where voter fraud happens. So we are seeing a cacophony of just all these different things coming together. And I think what we learned after Stacey's run, and really that election didn't end for another week, and we were ballot chasing in the rain, trying to track down all the provisional ballots that people were given, but the necessity of having a real robust voter protection program, not on the back end to sue after elections have happened, but building that into the actual process. And really, I think it vindicates a lot of the organizers who have been saying that this is year-round civic engagement, base building work. We cannot wait until 6 weeks out before an election to start talking to, communities of color. Georgia is on the verge of being the first BIPOC majority state in the South. I think it's by 2028. This will no longer be a white majority state in the South. And so there is this fear, honestly, of that collective power. We saw a surge in AAPI and Latinx voters also coming out in 2018. So actually talking to a diverse coalition of folks can win, even in a state like Georgia, and they had to suppress the mess out of the vote just to get that outcome. And that litigation, even from Abrams's campaign, is still ongoing with Fair Fight.
Thank you so much. And particularly for focusing on, the fact that so many of the remedies are not remedial because they come after the fact. And also highlighting that there's a method to this madness, right? It is about forestalling a moment in which the political power configuration shifts. And not surprisingly, that's a moment where we're likely to see, as we have, more repression, more suppression, and more justification and rationalization of it. I want to turn now to Emory. Over the course of Blacklight, we have anticipated and then we discussed the fact that African Americans are being disproportionately affected by COVID. But in Georgia, the numbers appear to be even more dramatic. So a recent CDC report noted that over 80% of COVID patients in hospitals there are African American. So can you describe to us what these numbers translate to for Black life in Georgia?
Definitely. And thank you, Dr. Crenshaw and the whole team of the African American Policy Forum for making this discussion possible. My fellow esteemed panelists and everybody in the chat. I think it's just a huge opportunity for us to come together and think through these very serious issues. And tonight, as it relates to Georgia, we're living in a public health system that's not designed to ensure the public health. We're living in a country where the history of the transatlantic slave trade and the results of that history for us as Black people has never been systematically dealt with. We're living in an economic system that rewards greed, exploitation, and extraction. So, we're living in a system where it's basically de facto civic apartheid, where we're effectively denied access to participate within civic life. So it's translating to food scarcity for our communities. People were already poor and working people in our community were already having trouble accessing quality food. And that situation is now just worse. It's translating to a situation where we don't have access to basic information that we can use to protect ourselves in this moment of pandemic. And now with this lynching, it's just exposing these deep histories that, like you said, are creating this perfect and horrendous in its perfection storm that is really leading to ultimately needless suffering and death of Black people throughout our state. And it's an unacceptable situation, and it's one that we are working hard to resolve.
And Emery, we do want to learn about what is being done, what can be done from the ground up. And we're going to turn to that in our second section. But one of the things that I do think people really are grappling with, and we're seeing it in Georgia, is what to make of the fact that with African American infection rates so alarmingly high, what do people think is behind Kemp specifically reopening businesses like barbershops, nail salons, churches? What is the conversation about what that's about?
That's right. Well, you know, I think in some ways, Kemp is sort of a middle manager for the Trump regime. So it's I think part of this larger effort where we're really a test case for the rest of the country. And just like they're testing bad sort of medical solutions on our brothers and sisters in Africa, they're testing what it looks like to reopen the state on Black life and the life of many oppressed people here in the state of Georgia. This is, nobody knows how this thing is going to develop. And so if they can do live tests with us as humans and see what happens when we go out to the barbershop, what happens if we go out to the stores and aren't socially distancing and think that this thing is over when it's not. So I think that experimentation piece is a factor. And I also think it's just a sort of callous rejection of life that this economic system that we're in perpetuates. You know, people are more committed to the rich keeping their wealth and continuing to remain wealthy than they are to most people surviving. And so if that means opening up the state when the entire public health community is in unison saying that is not a good idea to do, is just a callous disregard for life. And people who do not have access to information, don't have access to healthcare, don't have access to just basic needs, which is our people, are going to suffer the most.
And just to put a point on what the experimentation you mentioned resonates with, I mean, this isn't the first time that Black bodies have been experimented upon to determine the trajectory of disease, right? Tuskegee is just one thing that comes immediately to mind. So for those who are skeptical about the calculated decisions that might be underway, we're not just imagining something. There is a historical antecedent for this moment. So thank you so much, Emery. And thank you to all of our guests so far for this amazing, insightful conversation. Thanks for getting us started. We're gonna move shortly to our next section, but before we do, I'm gonna ask Awoye Tempo, our artistic director, just to give us a brief rundown about what we've been hearing online so far. Awoye.
Hi, Kim. How are you?
Hey.
Thank you so much to all the panelists and to all the people who are having just such a wonderful conversation in the chat room. You know, there's a couple of different threads of conversation. People are definitely appreciating the frame of lynching and the conversation around the criminalization of Black mobility, and also having a conversation about the nature of how the systems are built what they're designed to do and how they're continuing to function in exactly the ways that they were designed to. And lastly, people are just addressing questions of how effectively Governor Kemp was able to disenfranchise voters, the status of the post office, and also thinking about other voter intimidation programs that the GOP might be using in November. So there's a great and robust conversation happening online, and we'll continue to check in with you later in the show.
Thanks so much, Awoye. So we've started with a series of snapshots of what is happening on the ground in Georgia, and we want to build out further from those snapshots to explore the historical, political, or policy context. So I want to turn to Letha to get a sense about how we can read this against a conversation that we had a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about geographies of confinement and how they map the disproportionate infection and death from COVID. So prisons, jails, ICE, we know they're principal sites of confinement and thus infection. But there's another element, a few other elements, the deprivation of life-saving possibilities for incarcerated people, and even worse, the use of their labor to make PPE and other goods at rock bottom wages. So I couldn't help but think of this as modern day convict leasing. So from your research and what you've uncovered about what's happening now, would this be a huge stretch?
Well, thank you for your excellent question, Professor Crenshaw. No, I don't think it's a stretch at all. In states all over this country, prisoners are forced to work in unsafe conditions, making gowns, masks, and hand sanitizer for pennies on the dollar. And these are all life-saving commodities that they don't even have access to protect themselves. And Georgia has a long history of exploiting prison labor. The state's practice of exploiting prison labor for profit has its origins in the convict lease system that you mentioned. And this was a system developed by the state in 1869, which involved the hiring out of state prisoners to private industries in exchange for a fee. So it was a practice that disproportionately affected Black men and women. For example, in the mid to late 1800s, and as we know even today, African-American men and women were subjected to significantly higher rates of incarceration and longer prison terms than whites. And this over-incarceration was a calculated attempt to strip, newly freed Black people of their liberty, but also to profit off of their labor. So, during the first 40 years after emancipation, Black women actually made up nearly 100% of Georgia's female prison population, almost 100% of its jail population and its chain gang population. And so the practice of extracting and exploiting incarcerated labor, the labor of incarcerated people, in addition to women, has long roots. Women like Maddie Crawford, for example, were sentenced to work in a brick factory owned by the Chattahoochee Brick Company. Another woman, Ella Gamble, did her time in 3 prison factories and on a plantation. And she did this work while running from a whip or the sexual predator on the other end of that whip. So, it's my belief that Georgia is still under the influence of a white supremacist logic that promotes punishment over protection. And unfortunately, it's the same logic that has informed Governor Kemp's decision to reopen the state, knowing that Black Georgians are facing alarming rates of COVID infection and death. And so, as you mentioned before, the state is essentially experimenting with Black lives in an effort to ensure the safety and protection of white lives. And based on what I see, incarcerated lives don't seem to matter at all. So when you ask, what do you see under the Blacklight? What I see is carceral violence being meted out against vulnerable, at-risk individuals whose stories and experiences have been hidden from public view. I see tens of thousands of incarcerated women and men who now find themselves suddenly sentenced to death in Georgia's jails, state penitentiaries, and federal prisons. I see people who are terrified of contracting COVID and dying from its effects. I see Black women who are medically compromised, highly vulnerable, and neglected. I see people who are already sick and unable to receive a test, a mask, a bottle of hand sanitizer, an extra bar of soap, or medical attention. I see people struggling to social distance in an overcrowded cell block that holds over 100 individuals. And I see people who are being exploited by a corrupt criminal injustice system that continues to extract wealth from the labor of incarcerated people who are being forced to produce personal protective equipment that they can't even use.
Mm. So much there, Talitha. Thank you for that. And you know, you have brought into the conversation some dimensions, I think, of carceral strategy that some people may know somewhat about, but may not know it's reached into Black women's history. So when we're looking at the past and the present that shape Black women's vulnerability to confinement and COVID, what do you think is missing from how most people see that vulnerability, if they see it at all?
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem. You know, Black women's vulnerability, fragility, and femininity, you know, has not been recognized by carceral systems, and also, you know, even by the policing, you know, the system of policing where, you know, Black women are being brutalized and roughed up and attacked, you know, and they're not seen as women, or as women who are worthy of the protections afforded to white women. So I see a lot of parallels between the past and present systems of mass incarceration, which I believe derived in the 19th century and not necessarily in the 20th century context that we link it to. I see a continuation in racial disparities, even though the rate of incarceration for white women is going up, while seemingly the rate of incarceration for Black women in prisons is going down. Black women are still disproportionately incarcerated. They make up 13% of the general population, and yet they make up 30% of the prison population and 44% of the female jail population. So those disparities are still there. Sentencing disparities still persist. Black women are still routinely given longer sentences than white women. Over incarceration for petty crimes in the past, such as larceny, today translate into incarceration for nonviolent, quote unquote, offenses such as drug abuse, stemming from trauma. And so women's trauma is being criminalized as they're using drugs to palliate their pain. They're being punished for that. I'm also seeing violence shown toward Black female bodies, and again, an unwillingness to acknowledge Black women's vulnerability. And of course, the continuation of the exploitation of incarcerated women's labor. And that is something that now transcends race, but it did not in the past. And of course, I also see the continuation of the sexual abuse and domestic abuse to prison pipeline that has disproportionately affected Black women. So these are some of the parallels that I see between the past and present.
Thank you so much for that. And it reminds us, of course, that in our struggles against carceral strategies, the gender dimensions of it are still not as robust as they need to be. So one of our questions coming out of this is, what do we need to do to make sure that that visibility about the particular ways that Black women are experiencing punishment and surveillance and being caged? What do we need to do to make sure that that's part of our understanding? So thank you for bringing that and making it so visible to us. I want to turn to Latasha, who really made me sit up straight the other day when we were talking, and you told me about how the lessons from Georgia are what we need to learn about in terms of the entire country being under the good old boy Southern rule. So for generations, you told us about how it's been the federal government that served as a check on racial power of the Southern aristocracy. But today, the federal government is in the hands of white nationalists. So the script is being rewritten for all of us. So the way you framed it was, welcome to the South, as you said, in some ways echoing Malcolm X, who called everything south of Canada the South. So from Trump's White House to McConnell's Senate to Barr's Justice Department, what are we all seeing now that is old news for you?
So, you know, it is welcome to the South. I think now, like in the words of Malcolm X, anything below the Canadian line is the South. And I think we're seeing it now. and in a variety of ways. I do want to say how the South got to be the way it is. That one, when we're looking at it, this historical racial racism, that is structural racism that has gone really mostly unchecked. I think about even the community where I'm from. I'm a native of Selma, Alabama. And I think about here is Selma, this famous place that gave so much to voting rights. But when you go in that community, it's like a community that was abandoned, that they contributed so much to the advancement in voting rights, but yet this community, we did not see the economic rights, and there's a community that is really struggling. And so a couple of things I think that in the South, that I also want to think that is relevant to America, because at the end of the day, when we're thinking about it, is this whole notion of American exceptionalism. There's something that I even refer to as Northern exceptionalism, right? That in some ways that racism just lives in the South. That's not so. What we do see in the South is that in the South, there has been structural racism. The fact that the majority of African Americans are in the South, that many of those systems have gone for more than 400 years, really not being disrupted. And in many ways, the South has been the center of white power in this country, not just for the South, but white power in the entire country, and that's where the root has been. And so you see a major uninvestment. When you look at the levels of investment, from social justice through philanthropy to political money, it is pennies on the dollars than what you see in other places. And so what we've allowed is the South just to be, oh, like that's the South, but let's look who runs the country right now. When we're looking at who runs the South, there are Southern senators who are not just making decisions about Alabama and Tennessee and South Carolina, but they're running the Senate. They're running the Defense Department. They're running the country. And so ultimately, what we have to recognize is when we're not investing and aligning with folks who are doing work and resistance work in the South, that it affects all of America. It doesn't matter how progressive you are in California or New York or Michigan. At the end of the day, if the South and that becomes the center of white power that goes unchecked, and that it goes without us really making the kind of investment to transform it, you will get what we have or what we're dealing with now. It wasn't by accident that Trump's first rally was in Mobile, Alabama. That wasn't by accident. And so in that light, I would say that one, there's that's one part of the story of the South that is really about the road to hell. But there's also another part of the story of the South that I want to lift up is about the road to hope. That at the end of the day, the South has something to say, and not just in the context, and the only people talking in the South are not just the white races, right? There are people of color who have aligned ourselves in the last couple of years that we are also the site and the birthplace of major resistance in this country. And so I think that there's a lot when we're talking about how do we confront some of these systems, some of the structural racism. There are a lot of lessons that we can learn from people who've been doing this work nonstop in the South in terms of being able to work in conditions very, very under-resourced, under-invested, but yet been able to push back on these systems and make some incremental changes.
So one of the most important struggles that we've been hearing a little bit about so far is the struggle over how this next election is going to play out. So we saw in Wisconsin, for example, that one party was willing to force Black folks to choose between their lives or the franchise. Right. And that is not a new choice, right? That is very much part of our history. So clearly that's a factor that is playing out in Georgia. So how are folks thinking about how to maneuver within, these equally unpalatable choices, either vote or risk your life? What's on the agenda now for fighting against that?
That's a great question. I wish it was the Matrix where we had the red pill or the blue pill.
Yes, right. My favorite. Thank you.
Great, right? But we're not. We're literally in a reality that at the end of the day, I hate to say, like it sounds so oversimplified, but it's organizing. Organized people have power. if you look at where there has been transformative change, not just in the South, in America, throughout the world, it came when organized people got together and resisted. Even the very foundation of this country was based on a group of folk who organized themselves and said that they were going to pay some taxes on some tea and like literally start creating a different kind of revolution. My point is that part of what has to happen is organizing. And so what we have been doing is we've had to shift our organizing. We're known with Black Voters Matter. We're working in 11 states, most of them are in the South, and also Michigan and Pennsylvania. And so we're known from being on the ground and actually working in the field. What we've had to do is really be able to adjust to what's in the moment. Right now, what's in the moment before us is our people are dealing in the midst of a health pandemic. And so we've got to prioritize. Folks don't want to hear about voting when right now I'm really worried about my health, unless you're able to make the connection of how one is connected to the other. And so what we've been doing is kind of threefold. One, we've been putting our work around doing COVID-19 and really being able to provide mutual aid and support to groups directly on the ground that are serving our community. Everything from providing PPE and masks to actually feeding, doing shopping for seniors, and really organizing ourselves. The second thing we've been doing has been really around voter protection and election, which is why we're suing the state of Georgia right now. We have a lawsuit against the state of Georgia around the absentee ballots, where they're not providing postage. We believe that that's a form of poll tax.
Yes, right.
Yes. So we don't have right now our case is pending, and we're still fighting. So for November, that the state, and which in the stimulus package, by the way, it includes money for elections. So why aren't you paying for the postage, right, for people in their ballot? We know the answer to that, right? That's a rhetorical question I'm asking right now.
Right.
But the point, because it fits in line with the history of racism in Georgia. But in addition to that, there's also this other bucket that when people are traumatized and our community is constantly traumatized, we need Black joy and Black love. And so in the midst of this, we've also been hosting concerts and literally having check-ins, using text messages to call folks, and phone banks to call people and check and be like, how are you doing? Are you okay? This is a resource list for you. Part of what has to happen is there has been this model that I say in the model around politics that I call the organizing round up the Negroes. That 3 weeks before the election, somebody drops some money and say, go round up all the Negroes and then have them to vote, right? One, it's not sustainable. Two, it makes sense to me why people don't participate in the process. Three, it's not transformative, it's transactional. For us, our work is really based on being transformative, which means the core of our work, there's nothing magical about canvassing, right? If someone comes to your door and just hand you a flyer and doesn't engage you, I know for me, I forget the flyer. I come and shut the door, go watch TV, and even forget that I even got the flyer, right? But it's different when someone comes to my door and actually engages in a conversation with me. One, the first thing we do is listen. It's to really be able to listen and see what people are saying and what they care about, and then work a relationship. So for us, even in our organizing strategy, we had to change the methodology, but our framework and our values were the same. That ultimately we've built a organizing model based on relationship capital and building relationships with grassroots groups and grassroots leaders. And so now we've just had to add a layer of that, which hasn't been easy. I feel like I'm working double the time that I was working before, and I was working a lot before, right? But really be able to use these digital tools to be able to communicate with our communities and with our people and really be creative. But ultimately, it's really the power is in the connection and in the relationships.
So much there. Thank you so much. And thank you for reminding us about Black joy and Black love in the middle of all of this. I want to also lift up one very important thing that I know some people are going to be like, well, how is a postage stamp a poll tax? Anything that gets in the way between your right to vote and your ability to exercise it that costs you money ought to be considered a poll tax, especially when to actually go out and get a stamp and you're supposed to be sheltering in place also puts you at risk. So I love the rhetorical question. I love rhetorical questions. I think they're politically important to ask. With all this money spent on the election, where's the money for the postage stamp? So thank you for bringing that forward. So before we move to our roundtable discussion with our panelists, I want to check back in with the conversation online and listen to any questions from our audience, for our panelists. So Owoye, what's cooking?
Hey there, Kim, and thank you again to all the panelists. Everybody in the chat room is just so deeply appreciative of the honesty with which all the panelists are speaking. There's been some really wonderful comments, and interestingly one about talking about the Black Panther community health work and other kind of traditions of organizing. People are talking about the history of resistance in the South and really starting to think about additional strategies to be able to organize and be able to make all of these connections. There was a great question in the chat room as well about both the need to bring attention to the intersectional vulnerabilities of Black people and Black women, but also look at how the face of those impacted by COVID has clearly become more Black and brown, and just looking at how to grapple with the dilemma of intersectionality in this case.
Thank you, Owoye. So we now have about 30 minutes, and what we're hoping to discuss is what does mutual aid look like now? What can we learn from history? What is the way forward? How do we continue to operate within a paradigm of Black love and Black joy, especially when we are fully aware of the fact that our very lives are seen as expendable by those who are making those decisions. So I want to come back to Emory and hear from you about what the face of mutual aid looks like, what you are spearheading there that activists around the country really need to know about.
Thank you. Yes. You know, we've been thinking about sort of social movement response to disaster, really a generation of us since 2005, when the Gulf Coast disaster began to unfold around Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. And so some of my movement collaborators in the Southern Movement Assembly, Tufar Waller Muhammad, Gloria Kalanko, Suzanne Farr, I see are part of the call tonight. And we really came together back then to think through how can we as social movements respond to disasters at a huge scale. And Katrina was a big lesson around that. A few years back, we had our Southern Movement Assembly number 6 in Chattanooga, hosted by Concerned Citizens for Justice there in Chattanooga, and came up with this idea of building mutual aid liberation centers throughout the region. And so since that time, Project South with the Hunger Coalition and Carolyn Pittman have been working to develop a mutual aid liberation center at 9 Gammon, which is where our office and land is. So we developed it to be, you know, the community center that it's always been, but to also be a site that could be a place that we organize around social emergencies and disasters. And so when this pandemic started to unfold, we were able to really pivot quickly and not only get out there in the community and offer food and hygiene supplies and public health information, face masks and making hand sanitizing products, but we were also able to work with some partners and launch the first community-based movement-run testing and education site in the state of Georgia. And so that's been running for about a week and a half now. We are having an outpouring of people from the community come to get tested and to get other information about how to keep themselves, their families, and their communities safe. And so that's one piece that is in this tradition, as has mentioned in the chat, whether it's the Black Panther Party and what they were able to do in Chicago and all over the country, or this history that's part of our Black radical traditions of the US South around mutual aid. I mean, we've been coming together to build mutual aid networks by name and by principles for since, you know, the end of the Civil War. We've had mutual aid societies around just being buried with dignity. We've had mutual aid societies that are around pooling together our limited resources for collective financial survival. And this mutual aid center is a multifaceted center, but it's really in part designed to respond to the types of disasters we now see ourselves in the midst of.
And you know, Emery, I want to build off of what you said to come back to something you mentioned about your traveling with Latasha to NOLA. And it was, I thought, a really interesting, just tiny but powerful observation about what disaster relief looks like when it's coming from the community up. And so, Latasha, I don't know if you remember when Emery mentioned how you said what that story was.
You know, Emery, on our way down, this was at the height of it, and there are many places, rural communities in Alabama and Mississippi that were impacted that people didn't know about, and Louisiana as well, because they were hit directly. And on our way down there, we were trying to move. I was on the multiple phones, but we were trying to move food, and you know, something as simple as logistically moving water. I had no idea how difficult it was. That literally, one, having the access to pallets of water and then thinking through how to move it and to get it where it needs and to distribute it, particularly when there was a disaster. And so in many ways, you know, what happened in that circumstance, I was forever changed. That, you know, in one way, you know, my goal was, okay, I'll help, and then the real professionals will take over, right? And so I remember in that particular meeting, trip, at some point I had a meeting with the Red Cross, which was horrible. That's a whole nother session. Well, absolutely horrible. Where they set the centers up on the white, and if people know that, particularly in the South, the railroad tracks normally separate the black side of town and the white side of town. And for some reason, the centers, the rescue centers, would be on the white side of town, right? And so, and at this point, there was no transportation. The roads were, in many places, weren't clear. People, cars that got flooded, there was no form of transportation. So instead of taking things to people, they expected folks to come over to the comfort of where they were to be able to get access. And so we created the opposite. There were groups like Project South and ourselves and others that created what was called Saving Ourselves Coalition. And we had a coalition that, in the end of the day, we were like, they on this, we gonna save ourselves. We ain't waiting on FEMA, we ain't waiting on the federal government. And at one point, our operation was spread where we were working with 133 different communities all across the Gulf Coast region. At one point, FEMA was actually, there would be Black folks that worked at FEMA that were calling us saying, hey, I got a family, I'm gonna send over there to you. And so that's what happens with mutual aid when we're connecting. And even again, once in this circumstance, what we found ourselves, similar to what Emery talked about, some of us, we just knew to go into action. And so there are many of us that are leading these efforts. My organization, Black Voters Matter, actually set up a $150,000 fund to fund mutual aid throughout the South, the 11 states that we work with. And some of the groups that we're working with are actually doing complete direct services. We're not waiting, you know, and we're not allowing our folks to be vulnerable, but we're doing a couple of things. One, we're providing the services that are needed right now, but we're also advocating and we're fighting. And then the third piece that I also think that we often got to think about is we're visioning. We've got to vision something different. We can't just be in a space of that we're just reacting. We also have to be in a space that we're building additional infrastructure. So all of our work is kind of like at the intersection of that. Like as a Black futurist, like how do I respond to what is in the moment? And how do I think as a visionary about really creating the kind of nation that I deserve, my community deserves, and the people in this country deserve?
All right. And I also very much appreciated just the fact that mutual aid is also, you know, learning to be, you know, multiculturally lingual, because at one point you were saying, you know, even the food that gets eaten by different groups, we have to pay attention to that. And it really just stuck with me. So thank you for that. I want to bring Crystal back in and as you mentioned, that the amazing Ida B. Wells was just awarded the Pulitzer Prize for her investigative report on lynching. And, you know, I want to lift her up for a moment. In addition to your work, I also want to lift up Paula Giddings' biography of Ida, A Sword Among Lions. And I guess I want to ask, what's the consequence of how so much of her heroism has been lost to history? What's missing from the picture of lynching that she was able to paint for us, and what would it mean for us to bring it forward, particularly now that our attention has returned again to Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor?
First, Latasha, I just really, when I listened to you talk, I thought, this is our modern day Ida B. Wells. And I say that with just profound gratitude and admiration, because what you laid out, I think, I kept thinking about all of the things that Ida B. Wells had her hand in, right? That she was a radical journalist, and she was an educator. She was a suffragist. She was, most people remember her, if they remember her as like the godmother of the anti-lynching movement, right? But like you, she had her hands in a lot of pots, right? And she understood that, her anti-lynching platform, and this is one of the things that I think Paula Giddings in her work, I think Mia Bay in her biography, that we were all really trying to grapple with where she operated at what you would call the intersections of her identities and her politics and her commitments within the Black community. So one of the things that I have really worked to make the case for around Wells is that she understood lynching as a platform to make larger arguments about the needs of the Black community, right? And that for me, I wanted to see her as an anti-rape activist, right? That for her, sort of inspiring the Black club women's movement, which was in many ways a mutual aid operation, right? But also, she understood the political lay of the land. She was savvy, right? And she didn't suffer fools lightly, unfortunately, so that made it sometimes difficult for her. But that she saw that to talk about the lynching of Black men was not a zero-sum game. And I think that that's oftentimes the way that if we talk about police brutality, we feel like, oh, we have to focus on solely on Black men. And in some ways, we understand that the numbers bear that need to have that conversation, but she saw those as openings, right? Openings to say, we need to think about how the lynching of Black men is linked to the sexual exploitation and rape of Black women, right? We need to understand that the lynching of Black men is linked to terrorizing Black people and keeping them from the polls, right? That we need to understand lynching as about deprivation, right? And at the same time that she was making demands on the federal and local government, she was doing that work of what I think we call a politics of care, right? That you articulate so beautifully, Latasha, right? In the chat, somebody called it, relational capital, I think was the word that was moving through the chat. And I think that Wells was really committed to that work. And then I think that that's oftentimes why she slips through the cracks, because on the one hand, we want to pigeonhole her in a very narrow way. But she ran for political office, right? She lost, but she ran for political office. She was doing all of these things because she understood that there wasn't a magic bullet, right? That we had to be fighting on all fronts. And I'm just want to say how moved I am by your work, Latasha, and your ability to kind of articulate the necessity of that in the tradition of Ida B. Wells. So,
let's not forget, of course, that one of the reasons why we don't know about Ida B. Wells is because Ida B. Wells was Ida. And not Ira, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, it really makes a difference. Even in her own time, you know, basically not to have had, you know, access to leadership and to not to have had the full endorsement of Black male leaders at the time was a loss for all of us. And so I'm hoping that this moment is a corrective, not just to the national memory, but also to our own political processes and aspirations. And so on that note, I want to come back to Anoa, since we're you know, talking again about understanding the facilitation of lynching that is part of Ahmaud's story. There's all this stuff with the DAs. So one DA, you know, basically, you know, says that Arbery was a burglary suspect, and then another one has to recuse. It's a mess. So just tell us just a snapshot of how messy it is. We want to understand this in terms of what has been an effort across the country to promote a politics of replacing these prosecutors. And I think a lot of people getting excited about that. Is that a viable thought in this case and other places in Georgia?
I mean, I think that's a great question. I see it just came up in a chat too about is there such a thing as a progressive DA? And we saw this play out across the presidential election primary cycle, right? With Senator Kamala Harris and her, you know, rise in the ranks and conversation around that, right? Is that a possibility here in Georgia? I mean, I think no matter where we are, you know, this is still someone who has to come from usually within the community for a certain period of time with a certain politic. And I think that takes, going back to Latasha's point about a degree of organizing and building collective power. So I think that also takes actually nurturing and raising up, and to some extent, progressive lawyers who are willing to step into that role, then who also meet the qualifications to even try and run in terms of, you know, looking at electing DAs. But one thing that one of the organizers with the Just Georgia, so basically a statewide coalition has now formed. Black Voters Matter is a part of Just Georgia, along with the Southern Center for Human Rights, New Georgia Project, and several other groups that have come together to support the NAACP statewide and the local Brunswick chapter in the organizing aftermath around Ahmaud's case. We are now on DA number 4 in this case in about 2.5 months. The first 2 DAs, as you noted, recused themselves. But what's really interesting, in a letter the Attorney General actually sent, or a statement the Attorney General actually put out on Sunday, he has asked the DOJ to step in, not just to investigate whether there are hate crime charges or other things that the DOJ may be looking into, but specifically to look into the first 2 DAs. We have pictured Jackie Johnson, who's a DA of the Brunswick Judicial Circuit, where Glenn County sits, and then you have the neighboring DA from the Waycross Judicial Circuit, George Barnhill. Those 2 DAs, I mean, arguably conspired to keep McMichaels out of prison, right? From being arrested and from charges. You know, Jackie, in this document, the Attorney General indicates that Jackie Johnson and Barnhill kept from the AG's office in their multiple requests that Barnhill had actually been consulting on that case, handling evidence, advising the police for 4 days before they submitted an official request actually to the Attorney General's office. And it was at that time that Jackie Johnson had suggested that Barnhill be appointed, and they followed her suggestion, but never once mentioned that she had already called him in and he had already been handling the case. What later comes out, which also they failed to disclose, Barnhill took over a month, or approximately a month, to even disclose that his son was a prosecutor in Jackie's office. Not only that, but his son had previously prosecuted Ahmaud in an earlier charge when he was in high school, and that the elder McMichael had actually been the investigator on the charge. So at the same time that they are castigating and destroying this young man's reputation post-mortem, they are hiding all this information about their own conflicts of interest and really protecting these individuals who, I mean, we talked about earlier, what's the difference between, you know, police killing, as we've seen now in Kentucky, and vigilante justice. I mean, when we have DAs who take an oath to uphold the law, regardless of their personal feelings or relationships, that are acting in such a way to misconstrue, because we saw claims that they watched him, they were in pursuit of a burglar, like you said, using police language. I mean, this doesn't even fit in. Several lawyers have broken down the citizens arrest statute here in Georgia, which, you know, legislation is going to be introduced by Representative Renita Shannon and others to actually repeal that law, but it doesn't even meet the basic requirements of the law. And there's case law on point that actually does not support the action taken by either McMichaels, contrary to what Barnhill said in his justification, which he gave also orally the day after the murder happened, as well as several days before he actually recused himself. And we would not have had either of these DAs probably recusing themselves had it not been for the advocacy of Ahmaud's family in the local community in Glenn County in Brunswick, who were agitating. And Ahmaud's mother just said she just learned. She didn't know about all the details, but she just learned that there was a connection that Barnhill had with the case, with that office, and demanded that he recuse himself as well. So he was actually probably going to sit on that case and not even recuse himself like he should have been. So this also raises a lot of issues around prosecutorial accountability, which the Just Georgia Coalition has put out a list of demands which call for both the DAs to not only they recuse themselves, but to actually resign from office given the egregious errors, and for other necessary actions if possibly taken. So, I mean, there's a lot in this, but I think the organizing around DAs, but also sheriff's races, right? A lot of times in judicial elections, these are races that we tend to overlook. I mean, local and county elections get overlooked generally anyway, but these are also races that it can be difficult to find people who have a particular lens in politics to actually run for these offices. But then we also have to build up the actual infrastructure or progressive machine, so to speak, to actually support these candidates so that they do have a actually shot in the community. And that takes time. We saw what happened in St. Louis with Bob McCulloch. It took 4 years after the murder of Michael Brown to actually get him out. And that was a successful example, I think, that we've seen with Wesley Bell now as the St. Louis County prosecutor.
So it's a longer term strategy, but it is a political strategy.
It's a social and a political strategy, yeah.
So I want to go to Talitha, because we've been using terms that I would imagine some people might bristle at, right? We've been talking about the killing of Ahmaud as lynching. We've been talking about the killing of Breonna as an execution. And we've been talking about the genocidal dimensions of going back to business, knowing fully what its disproportionate impact on Black people will be. So I'm just wondering what you think about the work that's being done by those who want to limit the concepts of lynching and execution and genocide to only the precise contours of the past, rather than bringing these concepts forward to think about these contemporary deaths.
No, that's an excellent question that you ask, and I know that there's been a lot of discussion about that. Quite frankly, I don't think that, as I mentioned earlier, let me just back up. I, as a historian, am able to see patterns and see connections between past and present. And while the method or the technologies used to perform these quote unquote modern day lynchings may have changed, may have changed, the intent is still there. The mob element is still there. The hatred, the animus, all of that is still very much alive. And so I want to push back against those who seem to believe that lynching in the modern context, or quote unquote modern context, is different or varies much from lynching in the past. Whether you use a rope, whether you use a gun, whatever apparatus that you use to take another person's life, based on their race, based on their ethnicity, based on, you know, whatever it is that one finds as a way to dehumanize another human being. It's all the same. You know, the technologies have changed, but the intent has not changed, and the targets have not changed. So I think that they're, you know, one and the same to me.
Right. And, you know, we are in a moment, of course, where the decision to expend Black life for the economy is something that we've seen before too, right? We've seen it actually as part of the economic wealth that was the cornerstone of American you know, economic dominance. We also saw Black bodies being, you know, tossed over ships when economically it made more sense to expend our lives rather than save it. So, you know, these are patterns, as you point out, that cannot be reduced to just the particular technology of the loss of life, but the intention behind that. So, you know, we've had a rich conversation about both the context that's happening in Georgia, the patterns that we might be able to see play out elsewhere, the fact that we're, you know, all in the South throughout the country, and the kind of aspiration that has to drive our work forward, the embrace of the norms of Black joy, Black love, Black life, how that has infused the work that so many of you are doing on the ground, and the work that so many of you are doing who are doing research to elevate Black life, to bring it from the obscurity and the margins of history. So as we close, we have about 7 minutes. I think it would be inspirational for our listeners to hear what inspires you at this moment. What work inspires you? What do you want to share for our audience to participate in? What gets you up and pulls you through this moment that is unlike a moment that many of us have seen in our lifetimes? So here we just want quick minute or less, give us what your parting word to us is. I'll start with you, Emery.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, you know, what inspires me is really this vision that we're working on in terms of Project South and our partners in the Southern Movement Assembly, which is really a vision to remake our society for the liberation of all oppressed people. And that struggle, that vision towards that struggle, our struggle towards that vision is what gets me up in the morning. And I believe that we are going to win. I believe that social movements can become sophisticated enough and organized enough to respond to disaster and reimagine civil society. And so this pandemic is giving us an opportunity as a people to reimagine our world, and we need to take that opportunity. And Project South has also always been a believer in the power of youth. We run high school youth-oriented programming, and the courage and the vision of youth is also what always inspires me.
Thank you, Emery. And for all of the projects that are mentioned here, you'll be able to see information about it, both on the website and also in the chat. Crystal, let me come to you. What do you want to lift up, and what inspires you?
Well, first of all, my people, Black people, I'm inspired every day by our resilience, our courage, and our refusal to be erased, right? But it's also the work, whether it is on the ground, the work that Latasha and Emin and Anoy are doing, or whether it's the work that Talitha and Kimberly, you are doing to kind of articulate and record a Black feminist praxis, right? And to model that for the next generation, you know. So that's what inspires me. And I hope that we can all continue to learn from each other and be in conversation with each other, because I think that's the only way that we have a chance in making sure that Black lives matter, that our history matters, that our future matters, as you put it, Latasha. It's not just about survival in the moment, but it is about reimagining a world in which Black lives matter. So, yeah.
Thank you, Crystal. Anoa, what's to be done, and what inspires you to do it?
I'm inspired by the work of everyone here and what everyone just said, and all the organizations and organizers and folks that I get to talk to in the coverage and reporting that I'm doing with PRISM. And recently I got a chance to talk with brilliant author Mia Birdsong about her upcoming book, How We Show Up, Reclaiming Family, Friendship, and Community. And it really caught me because she wrote it before the pandemic, but it's so vital and fits into the mutual aid conversation we've been having. And it's just really hopeful and inspiring with all these brilliant minds reimagining what is possible going forward and how we can all collectively show up together moving forward, whether it's electorally, socially, in terms of health, economics, etc. So that's what inspires me.
Thank you so much. And Queen, tell us, Miss Latasha, what is to be done and what inspires you to do it?
We shall not be moved.
All right now.
We shall not be moved, just like the tree that's planted by the waters. We shall not be moved. You know, what inspires me is the spirit of my people. I mean, we can do the work, but I am from a people who were not, that there were folks who did not have a vision to see us here today. Yet here we stand. Right? I come from a people that didn't have government on their side, didn't have resources, but what they had is they had a spirit of resistance. They had a spirit to acknowledge their humanity. They had love for one another and also for the total of humanity. And as a result, here it is that I stand. And so what inspires me to do the work is that there are so many sisters, from the Fannie Lou Hamers to the Ida B. Wells to the Annie Coopers to the Coretta Scott Kings to the Nina Simones of the world, that every day I am still drawing from the spirit and the strength of those sisters in their gifts. So because of that, because they are, I am here. And so I'm inspired by my people and the spirit of my people that continues to live in me.
Come on now. Woo, thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. So many thank yous. I, of course, have to start by thanking our team that worked tirelessly to bring this important conversation together at African American Policy Forum and the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies. And I'd like to offer a very special thank you to all of the amazing, amazing panelists that you have heard tonight. If you like what you've heard, let them know. If you like the work that they're participating in, join them. Bring it on. So thank you to Crystal Femster, Anoa Changa, Emery Wright, Talitha LaFloria, and Latasha Brown. It's been an important conversation. Please share it with your friends, family members, within your communities. And you can follow us for more. AA Policy Forum across social media. You can follow me at Twitter at SandyLocks or on Instagram, Kimberly Crenshaw. We'll also be posting more information on our website, aapf.org, and continue to provide information, resources, and opportunities to galvanize our collective experiences into an energy that can propel us to another universe of possibility. We'll post this recording of this event on YouTube tomorrow, a summary on our website's blog, and our podcast, Intersectionality Matters, will host this episode next week. You can get it on iTunes, Spotify, and SoundCloud. Now, Wednesday's edition of Under the Blacklight will continue next week with an early afternoon episode entitled Narrating the Nightmare. It features Arundhati Roy, Viet Thanh Nguyen, and Kiese Lehman. We'll have more information for you in the coming days, so keep an eye out for our newsletter and look on our various social media accounts. You can also RSVP right now in the chat room and on our website. And we're excited to welcome some of our listeners to our post-show talk. Jazz Buckley, Morgan Everman, Tanya Clowney, Stephen Kidder, Cass Bowers, and Rhonda Oden. We'll also be joined by some of our friends and colleagues from past shows, Mab Sechrist, Barbara Arnwine, and Ernest Quarles. Thank you all. Enjoy your evening. Please stay safe, stay strong as we continue to organize and resist together. Good night.
Back down memory lane.